In New York City, most gangsters tried to be the toughest man on the street, but Lucky Luciano tried something different. He tried to become the man who controlled the whole street without always being seen. His story begins far from America. He was born in Salvatore Lucania, in Sicily. His family was poor. Life was hard. When he was still a child, his parents moved him to the United States, hoping for a better future. They arrived in New York, where the streets were crowded, loud, and unforgiving. New York did not welcome new immigrants with open arms. It tested them. Salvatore was small, but he was sharp. He learned English by listening, copying, and adapting. He watched how people acted when they were scared. He noticed who had power and who only pretended. He understood early that in this city, being weak was expensive. At home, his family wanted him to be safe and honest. But outside, the street offered something else: fast money, attention, and respect. In the neighborhoods where he grew up, some boys worked hard all day and still had nothing. Other boys broke the rules and walked around like kings. Salvatore did not want a slow life. He wanted control. As a teenager, he stopped caring about school. He began running with street groups. He did not become famous because he was the strongest fighter. He became known because he was useful. He could talk to different people. He could make deals. He could connect one group to another. That skill mattered, because New York was not just one city. It was many cities stacked on top of each other. Different languages, different neighborhoods, different crews. And everywhere, the same hunger for money. This is where the first big truth of his life appeared. Power does not come only from violence. Power comes from organization. Most young criminals chased quick wins. Salvatore looked for systems. People later called him Lucky Luciano. Some said he got the nickname because he survived dangers that should have ended him. Others said he always seemed to escape trouble. The exact reason is not as important as what the name did for him. It became a brand. A simple name that sounded strong. A name people remembered. A name that could travel from one block to another without him even being there. And Salvatore understood something very modern. If people remember your name, they believe your power is bigger than it really is. As he grew older, he started meeting other young men who also thought big. Men who were not satisfied with ruling one corner. Men who wanted to rule the whole market. These friendships mattered because they showed him a new kind of criminal thinking. Not how do we win tonight, but how do we build something that keeps paying next year. In the beginning, the work was small. Street hustles, protection money, and local deals. But the city was changing fast. Then came the moment that changed everything for criminals across America. Prohibition. When the U.S. government banned alcohol, it did not erase drinking. It created demand. And demand creates business. The product became illegal, which made it more valuable. Suddenly, alcohol was not just a drink. It was a gold mine. The streets felt it immediately. Bars still needed liquor. People still wanted parties. Restaurants still needed supply. And thousands of people were willing to pay extra for what they were not supposed to have. This was the moment when crime began to look like a company. You needed supply lines. You needed transport. You needed storage. You needed protection. You needed people who could handle pressure when police raids happened. And you needed workers who would not talk. The old-style gangsters focused on fear. They fought loud wars. They demanded respect the old way. Luciano saw a better path. He wanted structure. He wanted teams with roles. He wanted stability. He wanted to reduce chaos because chaos brings attention. And attention brings prison. This is why some people later described him as an Underworld CEO. Not because he wore a suit and sat in an office, but because he understood the most dangerous truth about the criminal world. The biggest threat is not your rival. The biggest threat is disorder. But even early on, Luciano's life carried a dark shadow, because the street does not allow you to grow quietly. When someone rises, others notice. Older bosses feel disrespected. Rivals feel threatened. Even friends start asking, what do I get from him? In this world, loyalty is often temporary. People stay close while it benefits them. Luciano learned this lesson early, and it made him colder, not heartless, but careful. He stopped trusting smiles. He started trusting results. As prohibition money began flooding the city, the stakes became deadly. Bigger profits meant bigger enemies. And in New York, organized crime was already under powerful leaders who did not like competition. Luciano was stepping into a world where one wrong move could end him. Not in a dramatic showdown, but quietly, in an alley, in a car, in the dark. Deep inside, he understood something painful. New York could make him rich, but it could also swallow him. If he stayed a small street player, he would be safe for a while, but he would never be free. If he aimed higher, he could build a lasting empire, but he might not live long enough to enjoy it. So he made a decision without announcing it. He would not just chase money, he would build a machine. By the end of his youth, Lucky Luciano was no longer just a tough kid from an immigrant neighborhood. He was becoming something more dangerous, a planner, a connector, a man who believed the future belonged to those who could organize power. And New York was about to enter a storm of gang wars that would decide who controls the whole city. Luciano meets the old boss's men, who run crime like kings. But Luciano doesn't want to serve kings forever. He wants to replace the kingdom with a system. And once that idea enters his mind, there is no safe way back. When America banned alcohol, it didn't stop drinking. It created a secret market, so big that a street kid could become a millionaire and a mistake could get him buried without a name. Lucky Luciano was still young, but he was learning fast. New York City was changing, and he could feel it in the air. People wanted pleasure. People wanted escape. And when something is forbidden, people often want it even more. Prohibition turned alcohol into a treasure. Suddenly, criminals were not only thieves or fighters. They were suppliers. They were movers. They were sellers. They were protectors. And the men who understood business thinking rose faster than the men who only understood violence. Luciano watched the older generation of gang leaders carefully. Many of them ruled like kings. They demanded respect, ordered hits, and punished anyone who challenged them. They were loud, they were proud, and they fought wars that turned streets into graveyards. Luciano did not worship that style. He respected it, but he didn't want it. He wanted something smarter. He started building relationships with people who thought like him, not just tough men-connected men. Men who understood money, discipline, and planning. Some of his closest allies were not the kind of people who needed to shout. They stayed calm. They calculated. They believed the future belonged to organization. Luciano's strength was simple. He could bring different people into the same room. That mattered because New York's underworld was divided. Different groups had different traditions, different neighborhoods, and different rules. Many of them did not trust each other. But prohibition money was so huge that it forced cooperation, and cooperation is where Luciano began to look dangerous. He wasn't just earning, he was learning how power moves. He saw that the real money did not come from a single night's hustle. It came from a steady flow week after week, month after month. If you controlled the flow, you controlled the future. If you controlled the future, you didn't need to fight every day. But there was a problem. In this world, success creates enemies. Older bosses noticed Luciano's rise. Some saw him as useful. Others saw him as disrespectful. Many of them believed the underworld should stay under their command with their rules. Luciano had to play a careful game. He could not look too ambitious, but he also could not look weak. He learned to show respect without surrendering his mind. He learned to smile while staying alert. Then prohibition pushed everything into a higher level. More alcohol meant more trucks, more money, more deals, and more chances for betrayal. Police raids increased. Rival crews stole shipments. People who once acted like friends started acting like predators. Money changed the temperature of the city, and Luciano understood something important. When profits explode, loyalty shrinks. The underworld became crowded with men who wanted the same prize. Some leaders demanded a cut. Some wanted full control. Some wanted to crush anyone who looked like a future rival. Luciano was now caught in a world where permission mattered. You could make money, but only if the people above you allowed it. And in New York, above you often meant men with armies. One of the powerful names in the city was Joe Mafia. He was not just a gangster. He was a ruler with influence, money, and fear behind him. Maseria's world was built on obedience. People around him survived by staying loyal or pretending to. Luciano moved carefully around that kind of power. He understood that one wrong step could turn a meeting into a funeral. But he also understood something else. If he wanted to build a lasting empire, he would eventually have to deal with kings like Maseria. Not by fighting them in the street, but by outthinking them. Luciano's mind kept returning to one idea. If the underworld keeps acting like separate kingdoms, it will keep bleeding itself to death. And death was not an idea to him. He had seen enough bodies to know it was real. Then came a moment that shook him deep. Luciano was kidnapped and badly beaten. He survived, but survival did not feel like a victory. It felt like a warning. Someone wanted him scared. Someone wanted him to remember that rising too fast has a price. He looked at his own blood and understood the truth in a way that words cannot explain. This life does not allow comfort. After that, Luciano changed. Not in a dramatic way, no loud speeches, no public revenge. He changed inside. He became quieter, more careful, more strategic. He stopped believing that being tough was enough. Toughness could win a fight, but toughness could not win a future. He began to think like a man building a company. Not a legal company, something darker, but still a system with rules, roles, and stability. He did not want to be famous for killings. He wanted to be necessary for order, because order creates profit, and profit creates power. But there was still one wall he could not avoid: the old bosses and their old wars. As prohibition money grew, the leaders above him started fighting more aggressively, not just for territory, but for pride. Pride was expensive. Luciano saw men die for insults. He saw crews collapse because someone wanted to prove something. He watched smart money get burned in stupid wars, and he hated the waste. By the end of this period, Luciano was no longer only a rising gangster. He was a rising strategist. He had learned how to build partnerships. He had learned how to protect the flow of money. He had learned that the underworld needed a new, structured one that could reduce chaos and protect profits. But he also learned the darkest lesson of all: if you want to change the system, you must be willing to break the people who control it. New York is pulled into a war that will decide who rules organized crime: the old kings with old rules, and the new men with new ideas. Luciano will be forced to choose sides, and the choice he makes will change American crime history forever. When a gang war starts, most men think bullets decide the winner. But in New York, the winner was often decided in quiet rooms by fear, ambition, and betrayal. By the early 1930s, prohibition money had turned crime into a gold mine. But gold makes people greedy, and greedy men don't share. New York's underworld was now full of powerful groups, and two major forces were moving toward a collision. One side followed Joe Maseria, an older boss who demanded loyalty and respect like a king. The other side followed Salvatore Maranza, a rising leader who promised a new order, an order that still sounded like a kingdom, just with a different crown. This conflict became known as the Castellamore's War. To the public, it looked like random violence. To the underworld, it was a battle for the future of power. Lucky Luciano was not the oldest boss, and he was not the loudest, but he was in the middle of it, and he could feel how dangerous the situation was becoming. He had worked under Maseria that gave him protection, but it also put chains on him. Maseria's world was built on obedience, tradition, and personal control. You didn't build freely in that system. You served. That Luciano respected strength, but he didn't respect waste, and he saw waste everywhere. He watched streets turn into battle zones. He watched businesses forced to pay twice, once to one side and once to another, just to survive. He watched friends disappear overnight because they were suspected of talking to the wrong person, and he noticed something that bothered him deeply. The war was not only killing enemies, it was killing the business. Shipments became harder to move. Deals became risky. Police attention increased. When violence rises, everyone gets nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. Mistakes create arrests. Arrests create pressure. Pressure creates informants. Luciano began to understand a cold truth. If this war continues, No one truly wins. Everyone becomes weaker. But walking away was not an option. In this world, neutrality looks like betrayal. If you refuse to pick a side, both sides start planning your funeral. So Luciano studied both leaders with the same sharp mind he used on the streets. Mafia was powerful, but he was also stubborn. He wanted total control, and he expected the next generation to stay in their place. The problem was simple. The next generation was not built to stay quiet. Maranzano looked like a fresh start, but Luciano saw danger there too. Maranzano believed in a strict hierarchy, and he wanted to place himself at the top. Luciano understood what that meant. A single king at the top creates a single target, and targets don't live long. Luciano did not dream of being boss of bosses in the old way. He dreamed of something different, a system where power is shared enough to reduce war, but controlled enough to keep money flowing. In other words, he didn't want a throne, he wanted a boardroom. As the war intensified, Luciano's position became more risky. He was connected to people on different sides. Some saw that as smart, others saw it as suspicious. Every meeting became a test. Every handshake carried hidden questions. He had to speak carefully. He had to act loyal while thinking independently. He had to stay close enough to survive, but not so close that he would be blamed if the wrong people fell. And he faced a personal conflict that was bigger than money. If he stayed loyal to Mafia, he might survive the war but remain trapped under an old man's control forever. If he shifted toward Maranzano, he might help end the war but then live under a different king who might distrust him. Luciano realized that the real choice was not between Mafia and Maranzano. The real choice was between the past and the future. The past was built on one boss controlling everything through fear. The future could be built on structure, cooperation, and planning. But the future had a price. To change a system, someone must break the old one. And breaking the old system meant people would die. It meant friendships would end. It meant lines would be crossed that could not be uncrossed. Luciano was not proud of that reality. He was simply awake to it. He looked around at the bodies, the chaos, and the wasted money. He remembered his own beating from earlier years, the warning written on his skin. He knew he didn't want a life where survival depended on luck. He wanted a life where survival depended on design. This is the part most people don't understand about Luciano. He was not driven only by greed. He was driven by control, because he feared what happens when control disappears. In his world, chaos meant pain. Chaos meant death. Chaos meant being left in an alley like a message. So he began to think like a man making a hard decision for a business. Not a good business, a legal one, but still a business. He asked himself questions that others didn't ask. What happens if this war never ends? What happens if the police crush everyone because the violence is too public? What happens if the old leaders keep pulling the underworld into self-destruction? Then he asked the final question. If the leaders are the problem, what must happen to the leaders? That question changed him, because once you allow yourself to think it, you are no longer an innocent player in the game. You become a person shaping the game, and shaping the game comes with guilt and consequence. Luciano didn't celebrate this. He didn't brag. He didn't announce plans. He became quieter than ever, because quiet men live longer in a war. He started building trust with men who also wanted the war to end. Men who cared about profit and stability more than pride. Men who were tired of watching the city burn. Luciano understood that if the war ended the wrong way, it would only restart later. The only lasting solution was a new structure, one that could settle disputes without constant bloodshed. But to build that structure, the war had to end. Lucky Luciano is no longer just surviving the war. He is positioning himself to shape what comes after it. He sees that New York's underworld is at a breaking point. The old kings are too proud to compromise. The new generation is too ambitious to stay obedient. Something must give, and Luciano is ready to help decide what gives. The war reaches its turning point. Powerful men fall, the old order cracks, and Luciano steps into the most dangerous role of all, building a new system from the ruins. But in the underworld, creating a new order can make you more hated than any enemy. New York didn't change overnight. It changed in 1 week of fear, one quiet betrayal, and one final decision that ended an era. Lucky Luciano didn't just survive that moment, he used it to rebuild the entire underworld. The Castellamarese War had reached the point where everyone was tired and terrified. Too many shootings, too much attention, too many funerals. The streets were tense, but the real tension was inside the criminal world itself, because when two powerful bosses fight, the men below them get crushed first. Lucky Luciano could feel the pressure everywhere. Every meeting felt like a test. Every ride in the car felt like a risk. People spoke in half-sentences. People looked over their shoulders, and the city had developed a new kind of sound quiet panic. Luciano kept his face calm, but his mind was racing. He believed the war was bad business. It was not only killing people, it was killing profit. Police were watching harder. Newspapers were printing names. Judges were pushing for action. Public anger was growing. Luciano knew something important. When the public gets angry enough, the government gets serious. And serious is the one thing criminals fear more than rivals. Behind the scenes, Luciano started focusing on the future. Not the future of one boss. The future of the whole system. He had seen the old way of power. One king on top, everyone else below. But the old way had a weakness. The king gets paranoid. The king demands loyalty. The king creates enemies. And eventually, the king becomes a target. Luciano didn't want to replace one king with another. He wanted to remove the throne completely. But removing a throne is not a clean job. The problem was simple and dangerous. Luciano could not build a new structure. While the old bosses were still alive and fighting, as long as they controlled the game, he would always be a piece on their board. He needed the war to end, and the war would not end through polite agreement. Not with men like Mafia. These were leaders who measured respect and fear. They believed compromise was weakness. So Luciano faced the kind of choice that changes a person forever. If he stayed loyal to the old boss, he might live if the old boss won. But even if Mafia won, Luciano would remain under him. No freedom, no new system, just more of the same. If he helped end the old boss, he might gain a path forward. But he would also create enemies who would never forgive him. And in the underworld, enemies don't always attack immediately. Sometimes they wait years, then strike when you least expect it. Luciano understood that risk, but he also understood that doing nothing was a risk too, because in a long war, sooner or later, everyone gets pulled in, even men who try to stay quiet, even men who think they can avoid the storm. The storm finds them. Luciano made his decision the way he made most decisions, quietly, carefully, and without drama. The details of what happened next are told in different versions by different people, but the result is clear in history. Joe Mafia was removed from power, and the war moved toward its next phase. The old king fell, and when a king falls, the whole city holds its breath. For a moment, some people thought the violence would stop. Some thought the underworld would finally calm down, but Luciano knew better. Removing one boss does not end a war. It only changes the war now. The other side rose stronger. Salvatore Maranzano gained control and began acting like the new ruler. He wanted to organize the families under a strict hierarchy, with himself sitting at the top. A new throne, a new crown, a new boss of bosses. At first, many criminals accepted it because they wanted the war to end. They were tired. They wanted stability. They wanted money to flow again without blood in the streets. But Luciano's mind stayed cold. He looked at Maranzano's plan and saw a future, full of problems. One man at the top creates two things: fear, because everyone must obey him; opportunity, because everyone below him will eventually want his seat. Luciano also knew Maranzano did not fully trust him. Leaders like Maranzano did not like independent thinkers. They preferred obedient soldiers, and Luciano was not built to be obedient. This is where Luciano's story becomes more human than people expect. He was not relaxed. He was not celebrating. He was watching a new danger form. Because now Luciano understood a painful truth. Even if you help end a war, you can still be trapped by what comes next. He had helped destroy the old order to create space for something better. But the better thing was not arriving. Another boss was simply trying to rule in the same old way, just with different rules and different punishments. Luciano felt frustration, and underneath that frustration was fear. Not fear of one man, fear of a cycle of kings, wars, and blood that never ends. He didn't want to spend his whole life fighting for power, losing friends, and watching the city burn again and again. He wanted something lasting. He wanted a structure that could prevent wars, because wars bring police, and police bring prisons, and prisons end empires. So Luciano made the second decision, more dangerous than the first. If the underworld was going to survive long term, it could not have a single boss of bosses. It needed a council, a system, a way to settle conflicts without constant killing. That meant the throne had to disappear, and for the throne to disappear, the man sitting on it had to fall. Again, the exact details are debated, but the historical outcome is widely understood. Maranzano was removed, and the era of one supreme boss began to fade. Two kings were gone, and now the underworld stood in an empty room, looking for the next shape of power. This is the moment that defines Lucky Luciano as America's Underworld CEO, not because he was the nicest, not because he was the bravest, but because he understood systems. He helped end the old war and open the door for a new model, one where organized crime would be managed, coordinated, and controlled through structure instead of constant street battles. But the victory came with a shadow, because when you change the rules, you create enemies who remember the old rules, and the government was watching closely now. Luciano's name was moving through the city like a rumor that refused to die. He had helped reshape the underworld. Now he had to build a new order before the world closed in. Luciano takes his boldest step, creating a system designed to prevent wars and keep power balance. The commission. But the more organized the underworld becomes, the easier it becomes for the government to point at one man and say, "That's the boss." And soon, a determined prosecutor will decide Lucky Luciano must fall next. Lucky Luciano didn't want to be the loudest gangster in New York. He wanted to be the man who stopped wars before they started. But the moment he tried to bring order to crime, he created a problem bigger than any rival. The government could finally see the shape of the machine. After the old kings fell, the underworld was standing in a strange silence. The streets were still dangerous, but the big war had cooled. Many men felt relief. Some thought, now we can finally make money without chaos. But Luciano saw a different truth. When the top men are removed, the world does not become peaceful. It becomes empty. And emptiness attracts ambitious people like a magnet. The underworld was full of bosses, crews, and families. Without a clear system, old problems would return fast. Jealousy, territory, fights, revenge, ego. The same cycle that had burned New York before could burn it again. Luciano did not want to rule with fear like the old bosses. Fear creates loyalty only until the moment fear disappears. Then people turn on you. He wanted something stronger than fear. He wanted structure. He began speaking to powerful men, not with emotion, but with logic. His message was simple. Wars are expensive. Wars attract police. Wars destroy business. And when business collapses, everyone loses. Most criminals think short-term. Luciano was pushing long-term thinking. That alone made him different-hand. Dangerous. He believed crime needed rules, not just threats. It needed a way to settle conflicts without turning the city into a headline. It needed a system where nobody could declare himself king and start another war. So he pushed an idea that sounded almost legal, almost professional, a council of leaders, a group that could meet, talk, and decide, not to become good, but to become stable. This idea became known as the Commission. Some people liked it immediately. They were tired of funerals. They wanted steady money. They wanted less drama, but others hated it because a system threatens. The men who survive through chaos. Chaos is useful for certain people. In chaos, you can blame mistakes on confusion. In chaos, you can expand by force. In chaos, you can pretend you are defending honor while grabbing power. Luciano's system would limit those excuses. Creating the commission was not like signing a paper and smiling. For a photo, it was dangerous, because Luciano was trying to tell powerful men how to behave. That is never safe. Some leaders saw the commission as a trap. They feared that Luciano was secretly building a hidden throne, a new kind of boss of bosses with himself at the center. They suspected that he wanted to control everyone while pretending he was promoting equality. And they asked a hard question: if we accept this system, who really benefits? Luciano understood their fear. He didn't dismiss it. He tried to design the commission so no single leader could dominate. He wanted balance. He wanted shared power. He wanted negotiation instead of constant street war. But he could not erase one truth. Even if the commission had many leaders, Luciano's mind was everywhere in it. He was the architect, the planner, the man thinking 3 steps ahead. And in the underworld, the architect is often more feared than the fighter. Even worse, Luciano's idea created a new kind of weakness. Before, the underworld was messy, hard to prove, hard to explain. When crime is chaotic, it's harder for law enforcement to point to a clear structure. But when crime becomes organized, it becomes easier to describe. The more the underworld looked like a system, the more it looked like something the government could target. And the government was already watching. Newspapers were hungry. Politicians wanted wins. The public had grown tired of violence and corruption. The city wanted someone to blame, someone to punish, someone to put on a poster. And Luciano's name was rising, not only among criminals, among officials. For the first time, Luciano felt the weight of his own success. He had built influence by being smart, calm, and connected. He had used strategy to survive wars and outlast kings. But now, his greatest strength was turning into a spotlight. And spotlights are deadly in his world. He wasn't a man who wrote down feelings, but he felt something human and painful. He had created order because he wanted safety and stability. Yet the order was making him easier to catch. This is the irony that sits at the center of his story. The more he tried to control chaos, the closer he moved toward a cage. Luciano began to sense a new enemy rising. Not a rival gang, not a jealous boss, a prosecutor, a man with patience, a badge, and the support of the public. Someone who did not need to fear underworld reputation, because he lived under a different kind of protection, law and politics. Luciano understood criminals. He understood fear. He understood negotiation. But a determined prosecutor plays a different game. A prosecutor doesn't need to beat you in the street. He only needs one case strong enough to convince 12 people sitting in a jury box. And once the government decides your name is useful, you can't buy your way out easily, because your punishment becomes a message. Luciano looked at the city and felt it changing again. Not the streets he could handle the streets. It was the mood of the city that worried him. When the public wants a symbol, the government finds one. And Luciano was becoming the perfect symbol. A famous name, a rumored mastermind, a man people could imagine controlling everything. The commission represents Luciano's biggest victory and his greatest risk. He has helped build a structure designed to prevent wars and keep power balanced. He has pushed the underworld into a managed era where business can run with fewer public explosions. But now the price of that stability is visibility. He is no longer just a gangster surviving the streets. He is a figure that powerful people want to remove, because removing him would make the public feel safe again. Luciano built a system to last. Now the government is preparing to break the man who helped design it. The hunt becomes personal. A prosecutor named Thomas Dewey decides Lucky Luciano must be taken down not as a small criminal, but as the face of organized crime itself. And once the government chooses you as the target, every door you once controlled starts to close. Lucky Luciano helped bring order to the underworld, but that order created a new danger. It gave the government a clear target. And once New York decided Luciano was the face of organized crime, the hunt stopped being business. It became personal. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's name was no longer just a whisper in back rooms. It was a rumor that moved through the city like smoke. People said he was too smart, too connected, to protect it. But protection has limits. New York was tired of corruption, tired of rackets, tired of feeling like criminals were running a shadow government. Police raids and arrests were not enough. The public wanted a big win-one headline that would tell the city, we took control back. That is when Thomas Dewey enters the story. Dewey was not a gangster, and that mattered. He didn't fear street reputation the way local officials sometimes did. He was ambitious, sharp, and hungry for results. In the 1930s, he built a reputation as a prosecutor focused on organized crime, and his most famous case became the one against Luciano. Luciano had survived wars and betrayals because he understood criminals. But Dewey was different. A prosecutor doesn't need to win with bullets. He wins with patience, paperwork, witnesses, and a courtroom full of people who want to believe the system can still work. Dewey's team focused on something powerful and ugly: the world of prostitution rackets in New York. Luciano had many enemies, but the case the state built was not about a street fight. It was about proving he sat above a large operation and benefited from it. Like a boss who never touches the product but controls the profits. The pressure came in waves: raids, arrests, questioning. More raids. Police and investigators hit brothels and related locations, pulling in large numbers of people, especially women, who suddenly faced charges, fear, and the possibility of prison. The city's strategy was simple: create enough pressure that someone talks. This was the part Luciano hated most. Not the violence, not the enemies. The uncertainty that because the underworld can handle war. War has rules, even when they are brutal. But a legal case is different. In court, you can lose everything without firing a shot. Luciano tried to stay calm. In his mind, he had two shields. Distance: he wasn't the kind of boss who stood on corners giving orders. Silence: most people feared the consequences of talking. But Dewey understood another truth: fear is not perfect. Fear breaks when a person feels trapped. Some of the arrested women were offered a path away from serious punishment if they cooperated. Others were simply scared enough to say what prosecutors wanted to hear. Over time, Dewey's case grew from rumors into testimony, and testimony is the currency of conviction. Luciano now faced a nightmare: a courtroom story where he was painted not as a street criminal, but as the hidden manager of a major operation to the public. It didn't matter how far away he stood from the day-to-day details. What mattered was the narrative. He was the boss, and the city loved that narrative, because it gave them one man to blame. Dewey's public image grew. Newspapers followed him. Cameras wanted him. People saw him as the gangbuster, who could do what others couldn't. The state wasn't just building a case, it was building a symbol. Luciano understood symbols too. He had built his own name into a kind of legend. Now that legend was being used against him. This is where Luciano's confidence meets something human: fear of losing control. He had designed structure because he believed structure creates safety. He wanted fewer wars, fewer reckless killings, fewer explosions that bring government heat. But the irony was cruel. The more organized the underworld became, the easier it became for the state to say, "This is organized crime, and this is the man behind it." Luciano could feel the walls closing in, not just the legal walls, but the emotional ones too. He had allies, but allies don't sit in prison for you. He had power, but power doesn't convince a jury by itself. And inside him, a quiet question rose, one he never wanted to ask. What if I built a machine so big that it finally forced the government to destroy me just to prove the machine can be stopped? He kept moving. He kept meeting people. He kept playing the part of the calm boss. But calm is not the same as peace. When the trial arrived in 1936, Luciano faced something he couldn't control the usual way: witnesses, testimony, and a prosecutor who was ready to make him the example. Accounts describe Dewey presenting Luciano as the top figure in a prostitution combination, with multiple counts tied to compulsory prostitution. Luciano tried to fight it. He tried to deny it. He tried to look untouchable. But juries don't judge fear. They judge the story in front of them, and the story was brutal. Luciano was convicted in 1936 on dozens of counts, connected to compulsory prostitution, and received a 32-50-year sentence, with sources commonly noting imprisonment at Clinton Prison in New York. For New York, it was a victory headline. For Dewey, it was a career-making moment. For Luciano, it was a cage built from paper and testimony. Yet even here, the legend didn't die. Over the years, some writers and scholars questioned how directly Luciano controlled the operation the state described, and whether the case relied on heavy pressure tactics. But whether he was guilty in every detail or not, the outcome was real. The man who helped shape the system was removed from the board. The underworld had lost its architect, and now Luciano had to face a new kind of life, one where the streets couldn't protect him, and the only time that mattered was the time written on a sentence. Luciano enters prison with a name that is still powerful on the outside, but inside, power works differently, and as the world moves toward war, Luciano will discover something shocking. Even behind bars, he may still be useful to people who once swore they would never need him. Lucky Luciano built power through control, but prison is where control goes to die. And when the cell door closed behind him, Luciano learned the truth the streets never taught him. A legend can travel, even when the man cannot. Luciano entered prison as a famous name, but prison does not respect fame the way the streets do. In the underworld, reputation can stop a fight before it starts. In prison, reputation might start fights. He was now surrounded by men who had nothing to lose. Men who didn't fear the underworld's rules because they were already trapped inside a different system, one run by guards, schedules, and locked doors. Every day had a rhythm that Luciano didn't choose. Wake up, count work, count meals, count lights out, count he had once managed risk with planning and connections. Now his world was measured in minutes and footsteps, and yet Luciano's mind did not shut down. He watched prison the way he once watched New York, quietly, carefully, always studying who really held power. He noticed which prisoners had influence. He noticed which guards were strict and which ones could be negotiated with. He noticed who wanted attention, who wanted protection, and who wanted revenge. But even if he understood it, he could not fully control it. That was the torture. Outside, Luciano had built a life where chaos could be managed. Inside, he was forced to live inside someone else's order. The first battle wasn't physical, it was mental. Luciano had lived by moving quickly, meeting people, making deals, solving problems before they turned into threats. Prison removed motion. It replaced action with waiting. And waiting is dangerous for a man like him, because when a person sits still long enough, the mind starts replaying everything. Old betrayals, old mistakes, old faces. He thought about the bosses who fell. He thought about the system he helped shape. He thought about the prosecutor who turned him into a public example. He thought about the witnesses who spoke against him. And then he thought about something worse than anger. Time, a long sentence, doesn't only punish the body, it punishes identity. It slowly erases the version of you that used to matter. Years pass, the world changes, new people rise, old allies die or turn, and one day you realize your name still exists, but your power has moved on without you. That fear crawled into his nights, even in prison. Luciano heard stories about what was happening outside, not in perfect detail, but enough to understand one thing: the machine kept moving. That was supposed to be a victory, proof that the structure was strong, but it was also painful, because it meant the structure didn't need him every day. And if the world doesn't need you, you become replaceable. Luciano had spent his whole life trying to never be replaceable. That is why prison attacked him in a special way. It didn't just lock him up, it tried to make him irrelevant. He tried to stay connected to the outside through visitors, lawyers, and messages. But prison communication is never clean. It's delayed, it's monitored, it's limited, and it forces you to trust people you cannot fully see. And trust is never simple for Luciano. Every message carried a question: is this person helping me or using me? That paranoia wasn't weakness. In his world, it was survival. But prison survival also has consequences. Luciano couldn't afford to look vulnerable. He couldn't afford to appear broken. Because in prison, weakness can become entertainment for the wrong people. So he held his posture. He guarded his emotions. He kept the image of control even when control was slipping. That kind of performance is exhausting. This is where his story becomes more human than most people expect. Luciano had always been surrounded by people, crew members, associates, rivals, negotiators, Prison gave him crowd noise without real companionship. You can be surrounded by men and still feel alone. And alone is when the mind becomes honest. He began to face questions he had never allowed himself to sit with. What was all the strategy for? If it ends here, what did he really build? Power or a target? Was he a genius? Or just a man who stayed alive long enough to be blamed for everything? In the quiet moments, he felt the weight of being turned into a symbol. Not a full person. A headline. A villain. A warning poster for the public. That kind of identity is a cage inside the cage. Because you can't argue with a symbol. You can't explain nuance to a city that wants a simple story. And Luciano understood something deeply painful. He had used his own legend to create fear and respect. Now the government was using that same legend to justify crushing him. The story that once protected him had become the story that trapped him. Still, he didn't collapse. Luciano wasn't built for collapse. He adapted again. He tried to make himself useful inside prison. Because usefulness is the closest thing to power a prisoner can have. He built routines. He built relationships. He kept his mind sharp. He watched for opportunities. Even though the word opportunity looked different behind bars. Then the world outside began to shift in a way nobody could ignore. War talk grew louder. Tension rose. America's focus started to move away from street crime and toward global danger. The news was filled with fear, politics, and the possibility of conflict spreading. And that shift mattered for one reason. When a country feels threatened, it becomes willing to make choices it would normally never admit. Luciano didn't know exactly what would happen next, but he could feel the air changing. In wartime, the government doesn't only arrest people. It also makes deals. It bends rules. It uses whoever can help protect bigger interests. This idea did not comfort him. It frightened him, because if the government ever looked at him and decided he was useful, that could mean anything. It could mean a chance at freedom. It could also mean being pulled into something dangerous where the cost is hidden until it's too late. Lucky Luciano is still a prisoner, but his story is no longer only about punishment. It becomes about leverage. He built a system outside that kept moving without him. Inside, he is learning how fragile a man becomes when his life is controlled by others. And now, with the world moving toward war, a new possibility appears in the shadows. The government may not see Luciano only as a criminal anymore. They may see him as a tool. The most controversial chapter begins. Rumors spread about quiet negotiations and wartime needs, about whether Luciano's sentence could be reduced, and what price would be demanded for that mercy. Because in this world, freedom is never free. Lucky Luciano was locked away and supposed to be finished. But then America moved toward war, and suddenly the government faced a terrifying idea. What if the docks, the ships, and the city's lifelines were not fully under their control? By the early 1940s, Luciano was still behind bars. The days were the same counts, routines, walls, and time that moved like slow water. He had learned how to survive prison, but survival was not the same as living. Outside, the world was changing fast. The news was filled with conflict, fear, and uncertainty. When a nation prepares for war, it becomes obsessed with security. Ports matter. Transportation matters. The flow of goods matters. And New York's waterfront was one of the most important arteries in the country. It was also a place where power didn't always wear a uniform. Everyone knew the docks had their own rules and spoken rules, enforced by men who weren't elected and weren't officially hired by the government. If something went wrong on the waterfront, it could ripple through the entire city. And then something happened that shook public confidence, major damage on the waterfront, sabotage fears, and rumors that enemies could attack America from within. Whether every rumor was true or not, the fear was real, and fear pushes governments into uncomfortable decisions. That is when Luciano's name returned quietly, carefully, in conversations that were never meant for headlines. Not because officials admired him, because some believed he still had influence over the right people. This was a strange moment where two systems collided. On one side, the government system, laws, prisons, courts, and rules. On the other side, the underworld system, relationships, fear, favors, and quiet control, Luciano had built his life inside the second system. Now the first system was wondering if it could borrow a piece of that power without admitting it. For Luciano, this was not a victory. It was a trap with a different shape. If the government approached him, that meant he had leverage, but leverage can disappear fast. And if he agreed to help in any way, he could become useful today and disposable tomorrow. He had to read the situation like a businessman reads a contract. What is being asked? What is being promised? What is the hidden cost? Accounts of this period are controversial, and different people tell it in different ways. But the common thread is this. During the war years, there were claims of behind-the-scenes contact, with the idea that Luciano could assist directly or indirectly by encouraging cooperation on the waterfront and discouraging sabotage and disorder to the government. It would be practical to the public. It would be scandal. So if anything happened, it would happen quietly. Luciano understood secrecy. Secrecy was his language. But this was different. This secrecy wasn't protecting crime. It was protecting the government's image. That made it dangerous. Because the government does not like being embarrassed, and embarrassment creates scapegoats. Luciano also understood another truth. When a country is at war, everything becomes urgent. People make decisions faster. They take shortcuts. They move pieces on the chessboard. Quickly and chess pieces can be sacrificed. He had spent years trying to avoid being sacrificed. Now he faced a question he never expected. Could he turn this wartime moment into a chance to shorten his sentence, or would it only deepen the chains around him? In prison, Luciano had time to think. Too much time. He thought about the life he built and what it cost him. He thought about the war that changed the underworld and the system he helped design. He thought about how his name became a symbol for the public to hate. And now, he faced something that made him feel both powerful and powerless at the same time. If the government needed him, that meant he still mattered. But if the government needed him, that also meant the government could define the story. Luciano's fear wasn't only prison anymore. His fear was being used and then erased. He knew how criminals operate, but he was learning how governments operate too. Governments don't always need to prove you are guilty to destroy you. Sometimes they only need you to be convenient. So Luciano did what he always did. He controlled what he could. He presented himself as calm. He didn't beg. He didn't break down. He didn't act desperate, even if he felt it inside. Desperation makes people careless, and carelessness in a negotiation can cost a lifetime. He wanted one thing more than anything: a door out, not a miracle, not mercy. A door. But even if that door opened, he knew it wouldn't open into freedom the way most people imagine. In his world, freedom always comes with conditions. Over time, the pressure shifted. The talk around his case changed. The possibility of relief became real. Eventually, after the war years, Luciano's sentence was reduced, and he was released under one hard condition. He could not stay in the United States. The deal didn't bring him back to New York as a free man. It sent him away from the city that created him. It was a kind of freedom that tasted like exile. For the public, the official story was simple. A convicted criminal was removed from America. For Luciano, it was more complicated. He had survived prison. He had survived being made into a symbol. And now he was facing the most painful twist of all. He might leave the cage but lose the kingdom. Because what is power if you can't stand where your power is? And what is a legend if it can't return home? Luciano was forced to leave America behind, but his name still moves through the underworld like a ghost that refuses to disappear. He is about to become something even more dangerous than a boss in New York, an exiled legend. Watching his empire from across an ocean, wondering if the system he built will protect him or replace him. Lucky Luciano finally walked out of prison, but his freedom came with a cruel rule. He could not stay in America. The city that made his name famous was now a place he could only see in his mind. Luciano had spent years behind bars, listening to the world move without him. Now the door opened. It didn't open into the life he wanted. It opened into exile. He was sent out of the United States and forced to live far from New York. For most people, leaving prison is the end of the nightmare. For Luciano, it was the start of a different kind of punishment, because Luciano's real power was never just money. It was position. It was being close to the streets, close to the right people, close to the deals, close to the decisions. In New York, he could read the mood of the underworld like a man reads the weather. He could sense a betrayal before it happened. He could stop a war before it started. But in exile, he lost the one advantage that made him dangerous. Being there now, he was watching the machine from far away, and distance is deadly when your world is built on influence. Luciano's first problem was simple. He was still famous. Fame sounds powerful, but it also makes you easy to track. Governments notice famous men, police follow famous men, rivals plot against famous men, even friends use famous men to make themselves look important. Luciano couldn't disappear, even if he wanted to. Wherever he went, his name arrived first. People didn't see a tired man trying to survive the next chapter. They saw a symbol, a legend. A rumor made human, and legends attract trouble. Luciano tried to remain connected to the criminal world, but exile changed everything. Communication was slower, trust was harder, and every message carried risks because he could never be sure who was listening. He was a man who once lived at the center of a network. Now he lived at the edge of it, trying to pull strings that were getting longer and weaker. That created a dangerous situation. If he pushed too hard, he would bring attention. If he stayed too quiet, he would become irrelevant, and irrelevance to Luciano felt like death. In New York, the underworld still functioned. The system still existed, but the people inside the system were changing. New leaders were rising, new alliances were forming, and time was doing what time always does, replacing the past. Luciano understood the truth better than anyone. A system doesn't love you. A system only uses you. The machine he helped build could survive without him, and that was both his greatest achievement and his deepest fear. Because if the machine could survive without him, then he could be replaced. This is the part where Luciano's story becomes quietly tragic. On the street, he was feared. In prison, he was controlled. In exile, he became something worse, a man with memories of power. He remembered the rooms where people went silent when he entered. He remembered the confidence of being protected by connections. He remembered the feeling of shaping outcomes. Now, he had to live like a man who couldn't fully control his own future. Imagine being known as a king, but unable to step into your kingdom. Imagine being respected by men who used to ask for your approval, but now you can't even meet them face to face without risk. Luciano wasn't a sentimental man, but exile has a way of forcing emotion into the cracks of a hard personality. Loneliness showed up in small moments, a quiet night where no one knocks, a conversation that ends too quickly, a city where your name means nothing to strangers, and the most painful thought of all, New York might remember him, but New York didn't need him. Luciano tried to stay relevant by staying involved, by staying connected, by staying in the conversation, but the farther you are from the center, the easier it is for people to control what you hear. Distance creates fog, and fog creates mistakes. Luciano hated mistakes more than he hated enemies, because enemies are obvious. Mistakes are personal. He began to feel the weight of being watched, judged, and limited, not only by American authorities, but by the reality that a famous criminal in exile will always have eyes on him, even when he wasn't doing anything. People assumed he was doing something. That is the curse of a legend. You never get to be ordinary again. Life has become a battle between legacy and reality. His legacy says he helped shape modern organized crime, built structure where there was chaos, created stability where there were wars. But reality says he is far from America, trying to hold on to influence with fewer tools, fewer trusted faces, and fewer chances to control the game. He is alive, but the world that made him powerful is moving forward without him. And Luciano, the man who feared disorder more than anything, now faces the one disorder he cannot fix. Time, Luciano's story, reaches its final act, the ending of the man and the survival of his blueprint, because even when a legend fades, the system he built can keep breathing for decades. If you're still watching, comment, because the last chapter explains why Lucky Luciano's name never truly left America, even when his body did. Lucky Luciano built a system so strong it could survive without him, But the final twist is this: the system he helped create outlived his power, and it outlived his freedom. By the time Luciano reached his later years, he was living far from New York, the city that shaped him and the city that could never fully let him return. His deportation meant his life was now a long distance from the center of American crime. Even if his name stayed famous, from the outside, people imagined exile as a softer ending, a gangster sitting in comfort, protected by myth. But real exile is not comfort, it is limitation. Luciano had once controlled outcomes by being close to them. He could read faces, hear rumors, and stop trouble early. In Italy, he lost that closeness. Messages took longer, trust became harder. And when you are not physically present, other people start making decisions without you. That is how power fades in the real world, not with one dramatic punch, but with distance and time. Luciano's biggest conflict in exile was not only the police, it was the shifting ground under him. His name still mattered, but his control was weaker. He was watched by Italian authorities and lived under scrutiny, which meant every move carried risk. At the same time, the American underworld kept evolving. The boardroom concept he helped push leaders meeting, negotiating, and managing disputes continued to influence how organized crime avoided constant street war. This governing idea is often described through the Commission, which sources commonly date to 1931, in credit to Luciano after the Castellamorese War. But here is the painful part. A system is loyal to itself, not to its founder. Luciano had spent years building a structure because he believed structure meant survival, and he was right. Organized crime became more stable. Yet the same stability made it easier for others to rise without him. So Luciano lived with a quiet tension. If he tried to pull too hard from exile, he attracted attention and risk. If he pulled too little, his influence disappeared. And in the criminal world, disappearing is the same as being replaced. As Luciano aged, the story that once protected him became a kind of prison too. He had become a symbol. To some people, he was the man who organized the American Mafia. To others, he was the face of corruption and cruelty. Either way, he was no longer allowed to be a normal person. And symbols don't get peace in the quiet moments. Luciano had to face the cost of the road he chose, not just the prison years, not just the exile. The deeper cost, a life built around control, ending with less control than he ever imagined. He had chased order because he feared chaos. He had tried to reduce violence between powerful crews because violence brought police and ruined business. But none of that made him safe in the end, because the real truth is simple. You can build rules for other men, but you can't build rules for time. In the end, time is the only boss nobody beats. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano died of a heart attack at Naples Airport in Italy. Accounts describe him being there to meet an American producer about a film project based on his life. That ending matters because it strips away the myth. He didn't die in a dramatic war. He didn't die in a final shootout. He died like many men do suddenly, with his story still unfinished in the public imagination. After his death, his body was returned to New York for burial, showing the final irony. The city he could not return to while alive is where his name was laid to rest. And what about the Underworld CEO legacy? Luciano's lasting impact was not a single territory or a single rackets list. It was the idea that organized crime could be managed like an enterprise through rules, mediation, and shared leadership rather than endless public war. The Commission is widely described as the governing body meant to mediate conflicts and oversee major mafia activity across families. But a responsible ending also tells the other side. A better organized criminal world does not mean a better world. It often means crime becomes harder to stop, more stable, and more damaging over time. The structure that reduced chaos for gangsters did not reduce harm for victims. Luciano's story is gripping because it is strategic and dramatic, but it is not a success story. It is a warning about what happens when a person builds an identity around power. Even if you win today, the bill arrives later. If you watch this entire series, type Luciano in the comments so I know you made it to the end. If you want the next true life legend in the same 10-part style, comment Gotti or Lansky. Subscribe for biography stories that don't just tell you what happened, They explain how power rises and how it falls.